We're here at the Walker Art Center for a dialogue with Luca Guadagnino. Tonight's program is entitled Luca Guadagnino, Love and Horror, in which I'll talk with Luca about his remarkable career as a filmmaker. Luca Guadagnino was already 38 when I Am Love, his breakthrough feature, screened at Lincoln Center and MoMA's New Directors, New Films Festival in New York. Though he had already been working in film for a decade, with 2 narrative features, several documentaries and shorts to his credit. But I Am Love felt like a debut, announcing a director drunk on the possibilities of cinema and in total command of the medium. It was a dizzying rush of images, sounds, scents, textures, and tastes, all meticulously choreographed by cinematographer Yorick Lusso's pirouetting camera and scored to the adagio strings of composer John Adams. Above all, there was Tilda Swinton, Guadagnino's frequent collaborator, glorious as the wife of a wealthy businessman who finds herself falling for the charms of a much younger chef. Guadagnino's films pulsate with such currents of longing and desire, which sweep the characters helplessly towards both freedom and loss. Whether it's the decadent British rock star and her entourage, baking under the Pantalorean sun in A Bigger Splash, or the American expat family in Crema hosting a summer visitor in the Oscar-winning Call Me By Your Name. Even Guadagnino's latest, Suspiria, an ostensible foray into the horror genre, is at heart very much a darkly romantic melodrama, in which the stirrings of the heart prove to be the most powerful witchcraft of all. I'm Scott Fondas, Production and Acquisitions Executive for Amazon Studios, and we'll now begin our dialogue with Luca Guadagnino. Well, it's always a pleasure to be here at the Walker, but it's a special pleasure to be here with Luca, since so much of the last 2.5 years of my life was spent working very closely with him on the making of Suspiria, which we'll talk about in some detail later on. But I think it's always interesting to start these things by talking a little bit about what your first sort of memories are of cinema as a spectator, especially since you grew up in Ethiopia, and I'm curious what your exposure and access to movies was at that time, and what language they were in, and what struck you about cinema as a young viewer.
Hello. I'm happy to be here. It's true that I started watching movies when I was very young, or probably, if I remember properly, like when I was 3-4 years old, because my father and my mother, they've been very drawn by movie theaters and movies in general, and they used to go a lot to the movies, and they used to bring us to the theaters with them. So the first image I have in my mind is Lawrence of Arabia, watched on my mother's lap in a big theater in Ethiopia. I don't remember what the language of these movies were. I suspect it was in Italian. Mm-hmm. But maybe I'm wrong. I remember I had many shocks in my upbringing as a young person, watching that, watching The Argonauts, watching Apocalypse Now, mm-hmm. at the age of 8. I always been very proud of this kind of attitude from my parents of bringing me to see these kind of films. But I'm not sure if I had children now, if I would allow them. It was important for me, though, to watch these kind of really upsetting films. I've been cultivating the art of watching extreme films for many, many years. I mean, imagine watching Psycho when you're like 7 or 8. And starting to form your idea of human nature through the prism of Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann. Yeah, so those were some of my... But I also remember Some Like It Hot. This was another early vision for me, which is a very violent movie in the first 20 minutes. So.
And I know you've talked a lot in the promotion of Suspiria sort of about the impression that just seeing the poster for Suspiria made on you at a young age. When did you start thinking about cinema as something that might be more than a hobby, and that it might be something you would actually make yourself?
I think it's never been a hobby for me, ever. I think that I cultivated the love for films and a sort of irresponsible, unaware idea of wanting to be a filmmaker since I was super young. I had a Super 8 camera when I was like 7 or 8. But as far as my parents or people around me remember, I always wanted to be a director since I was a very small kid. I didn't know what it meant. I remember I watched a very, very bad version of Spider-Man. It was like 79. And I was completely convinced that he was in the screening, in the projectionist room, crawling on this. No, like that was my idea of cinema. But, and I hope that some part of me still think about that way, about movie making. Yeah, as far as I remember, cinema and I have been together since I'm an aware person.
But it did take you a little while to get there, and in the wonderful profile of you in the New Yorker last fall, you described your...
Well, that profile depicts me as a pornographer. And I think in doing that, it puts too many accents on that part of me.
Well...
But I like how Nathan Heller writes, beautiful. And it's an honor to be featured in such a way. But maybe there were too many episodes that were leading to an idea of me that I was surprised.
Well, you do, he describes you in there, or perhaps you describe yourself in there as being something of a wanderer in your 20s and having a variety of different jobs, including being a cook, which somehow brings you back around to movies eventually. But tell us about that period of your life. What was happening between the time you went to university and when you started to make films?
Well, I started to make films since I was very young. I did many short films in Super 8 when I was 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15. Then I started to use other means like VHS cameras, H8 cameras. I think I filmed with all the cameras possible. I did a documentary when I was like 20 on a blue-collar worker in a factory for Fiat, who now is owning some American car company, and FCA now is the name. And they pay taxes in Luxembourg, and neither here nor in Italy. And I did that documentary. It was a short documentary. I presented that in a festival that was like a sort of grand, like a sort of like off festival. And I always wanted to make films, and I always did films. Like I did what I could afford with my intellectual means, with my awareness, and with the means I could provide for myself, the technical means. But I never diverted from making films. It's just that because I didn't want to have a job that wasn't that, I started to try to source money from many possible ways, including teaching how to make pastry to rich ladies in Rome, or stuff like that. I thought it was better than setting up into a proper job and maybe forgetting that I had to be making films as a mission in life.
So talk a little bit about making, let's say, your first short film that achieved significant international exposure, Qui.
Oh.
And how that changed.
But that's bad, because now you bring me back to the pornographer. But I don't want to be framed for the part as a whole. But it's true.
We won't make that
That
mistake.
in 1993, this connects with my idea of extreme cinema, you know? You know, I'm watching all these films, watching the films by Pasolini, Oshima. Oshima has been incredibly influential in me. Nagisa Oshima is a Japanese filmmaker who has made some of the greatest movies of the second half of last century.
In the realm of the senses.
Including The Realm of Senses that I saw when I was 14, and it was like a shock. And I was trying to challenge myself because, you know, like that film is about a couple who basically shut the world out, and they spent their entire time in the movie making love in the most explicit way until the woman inadvertently killed the man in a sort of kinky game. And I was always thinking, what was the position of the filmmaker? How do you film scenes like that? And it was really something that I was really obsessed by. What was the limit of the mise-en-scène and cinema, and what is the relationship with what is behind the camera and in front of the camera when it comes to that kind of topics or acts. So I decided to make a short film that in a way tried to encompass Oshima. And it was about a couple, boy and girl, and a sexual act filmed in its complete explicitness. And probably in a sort of pseudo-intellectual trip, I don't know. I should see it again. I haven't seen it since a long time. I wanted to cross over the boundaries of pornography and do something that wasn't pornographic by being explicit. So that's what I did. It was shot in 16 millimeters, and then we blew the movie in 35. And we went to the Taormina Film Festival, and it was a scandal, of course.
And yet, ironically, when you were...
But the actor who plays the man ended up being one of our greatest stars in Italy, Claudio Gioè, wonderful actor, and Zita Donini, she's the only actress who accepted to play in the movie. She knew the script, and she called me and said, I want to do it. So, okay, are you sure? Sure. I met her again a few years ago.
But it's interesting, you know, talking about the kind of extreme cinema of Pasolini, Oshima, and then you know, seemingly at the opposite end of the spectrum, as a university student, you write a thesis on the films of Jonathan Demme, who we think of as being a very humanistic and subtle filmmaker, perhaps with the notable exception of something like Silence of the Lambs, which is a genre piece. What is the point of connection in the filmmakers that you... Well, that's in a way the question. Like I'm
only interested in humanistic filmmakers. I now know that I am really sparkled by the perspective where a filmmaker is very drawn by the humanistic aspect of what he or she wants to tell. Like Oshima and like Pasolini, Jonathan Demme has never shied away from the nature of the human condition in a way. It's only that he has as a sort of a kind vision of life. But at the same time, it's been very tough. Like, if you remember Philadelphia, which is one of the greatest movies of the 90s, it is apparently a sort of melodrama about a politically correct melodrama, but in truth is a very, very sharp dissing of capitalism and the inequality institutionalized into that, you know? It's a movie about how unequal is a capitalistic society. And that was always the thread of Jonathan Demme's filmmaking, in my opinion. But only because he loved his characters and the people off-center, his movies comes across as kind, but they're very tough as well.
You make your first feature film in London, The Protagonists, and it's also the first of your now many collaborations with Tilda Swinton.
The second. The first was called The Penny Arcade Peep Show, was a short film from William Burroughs' novel The Wild Boys, which I haven't optioned the rights for. We recorded Tilda's voice, and I was supposed to shoot afterwards a man's body, and then we never found the money, so we have the recording of Tilda's voice.
So you might still complete it someday. And talk about that meeting, how you and Tilda first came to work together, and since we're going to see quite a lot of her over the rest of the evening, why that's been such a fruitful collaboration artistically.
Well, if it's fruitful, I think the audience can judge. I can tell you that it's a very beautiful friendship that started then and it's continuing now. I had been a big fan of Tilda since I saw her in Caravaggio by Derek Jarman, filmmaker I always worshipped. And by the time she had made Orlando, who made her into an international star, I was like member of the fan club already. I saw all her movies since Caravaggio. I recouped Aria, all the Germans. I think I became friend with Tilda because I'm shameless, and I went to see her in a situation like that. She was having she was talking to an audience in Rome. And I went to her without, I mean, my English tonight is bad because I'm jet lagged, I'm sorry for that. But my English then was even worse. And in a strange fashion, I told her that I wanted to work with her. And instead of saying, okay, thank you, bye, she said to me, call me at this number at this hotel tomorrow and I'm gonna see you. And I did call her. And she said, yeah, let's meet. And we met. And I proposed her this crazy thing. And she said, sure, when do you want me? And I didn't have a plan. I invented a plan, and I said, August. Okay. It was April, and Berlusconi had just won the election for the first time in Italy. It was a bad time, as you can definitely sympathize with me because I sympathize with you guys. And so we met, and she said yes. She came back in August, and we never parted ways.
And of course, it was your next feature together, I Am Love, which became really the kind of international breakthrough for you, and was shown in Venice and at New Films Festival in New York, and feels in many ways, and in Toronto. And
actually, Toronto changed the game because we did that movie we had to make that film. I had to make that film. I came out from a terrible experience working on a movie called Melissa P, where I had been tortured by the producers of the film. And I said to myself, I will never make a movie if I have to be in that situation again. So I decided to be in charge. And that's when I started producing my own films and other filmmakers as well. And then we presented the movie to Venezia, who at the last minute, they promised the competition, then they rejected the movie and they put it into a sidebar. And they said, okay, we go. And we had this screening that ended up into a big boo, like boo, boo. But the same night, we started to have incredible reviews from Variety, Hollywood Reporter. Really, really impressive, that something really strong. And in Venezia, there was a moment in which somebody wanted to give the movie to a sales agency that was an Italian sales agency. And I said, no way, we have to wait for Toronto. And I knew then that the movie, because of what I heard from the international press, I felt there was something there. We went to Toronto, and that was the moment of the shift for the film. It was a really wonderful moment, yeah.
And were there ways beyond being the producer yourself in which you felt that this film was different than everything you had done before? I'm thinking in a way that Saul Bellow has said in interviews that when he wrote The Adventures of Augie March, which was not his first novel, that it was really the first time he felt he was truly expressing himself in his voice. And I think there are ways in which I Am Love feels like the full flowering of a filmmaker.
Well, again, apart from Melissa P., I always had made what I wanted to make. I am very ambitious, but at the same time, I'm a realist. You know, like I like history books about the strategy of war. You can understand how they move the great generals, what tactics they had made to win the battles, why some great general lost the battles. And I think it's important to know the terrain where you're going to move and to be able to talk to your troops in the right way. And so for me, I Am Love is not that what you mean, what you said. Is the movie where I did the movie that I wanted to do, and that was the movie I wanted to do then. Before that, apart from Melissa, I had done what I wanted. I wanted to make more experimentally approached filmmaking. I wanted to make films that were contaminated by a documentary. I did what I really wanted to do, and in doing that, I was super happy. And I grew up with a group of people that I still work with throughout these films. And together we got to understand cinema more and more and more. So, you know, like, I Am Love was something I wanted to make for a long time, actually before I did Melissa P. And then we could put together the money because it was the right time. I don't know if there are young filmmakers here. Is there any young filmmakers here? Hello?
Few, yeah.
So the good thing about cinema is to be strategic and to know when the right time is to take action or to wait.
So let's take a look at a scene from I Am Love for people. I think most people probably know the film, but it is the story of a woman in a marriage that is on the downslide of passion and who falls for the charms of a much younger man, a chef who is the son of her friend.
So it's the cliche of a bored lady.
Exactly. And at this point in the movie, takes off for San Remo in pursuit.
We must say that she's Russian.
Yes, she is a
She's
Russian
a Russian
immigrant.
woman who emigrated from Russia, and she married a very wealthy man. She morphed into a Milanese lady, but she is Russian, and that's important for the sequence you're going to see.
And she is, of course, played by Tilda Swinton.
In Italian, with a Russian accent. And I'm serious.
Edo, amore, sono fuori città. Ho deciso di andare a Nizza da Betta. No, non dirle niente. Ti chiamo dopo. Grazie.
Signora Recchi, lei che ci fa qua?
Sto andando a trovare Beta.
Ah già, la mostra a Nizza, me l'aveva detto,
sì.
Edo.
Lei invece?
Beh, oggi il ristorante è chiuso.
Ah sì, il giovedì, la campagna, le verdure.
Beh, se non è troppo impegnata, perché non mi accompagna su? È solo una piccola deviazione. Le faccio vedere dove facciamo il ristorante con Edo. Lui è già venuto su qualche volta,
Va bene.
Ok, il furgone là.
We should talk a little bit about the wonderful music of John Adams that's used throughout the movie, and music used very expressively as a constant in your films, including the wonderful Tom York score for Suspiria. But this, I think, is the first time that John Adams allowed for his music to be used as an entire score for a film, and can you talk a little bit about convincing him to allow you to do that?
When I was editing in Madrid, Melissa P., Madrid, because it was a co-production, the movie was a Sony International production. At the time, the department was run by the legendary Gareth Wigan, a great executive and wonderful man. And he had given to me as a gift for my birthday a naive and sentimental music by John Adams. And it was 2005, and I didn't know anything about John Adams then. But what I know, I love the cover of the album. And so I put the music on my stereo back home, and I was like enraptured immediately. And I had already started writing I Am Love, and suddenly it was like an epiphany, as if the music I had in my mind for the movie was coming out from the speakers, existing already in reality. So from that moment I started to investigate as much as I could this great composer, and I learned about his amazing canon. And then a few years later, 3 years later, when we started shooting the film, we were shooting the film really with loudspeakers. Like the sequence you saw, the camera was chasing Emma, who was chasing Antonio, and we were chasing the camera with the loudspeaker with Lollapalooza. That's the title of the piece by John Adams, Loud in Sanremo. So she moves by the rhythm of the music by John Adams, and you can see that. It's a very choreographed sequence in that regard. And so we started to edit the film with Walter Fasano, my longtime collaborator and friend and editor, only using John Adams. And you ended up having like 70 minutes of music by John Adams. So we inquired for a preview budget, like how do you call it, to understand how much was going to cost. And it was impossible for us. It was really impossible. So we were like lost, because without the music by John Adams, for me the movie didn't exist. So what we did, Tilda wrote a letter to John Adams. We found the address. She wrote this mail saying we had made this film, that the music was featured in the movie. Would it be so kind to watch the movie and maybe eventually help us? He wrote us back immediately saying, I'm going to be in London like next month and I will be happy to see the film. I said, really? Wow. So we organized a screening for John Adams and in a hotel in London. And so we have the screening room. He arrives, very nice, but also very dry. I mean, real serious artist. We are buffoons, and he's a real artist. So he sits, until then we sit like 3 rows above, and the movie goes. And someone has seen the movie, I'm sure. So at the end of the film, there is the last scene when Emma leaves the house and the family, and in that moment, I think we used Armand Lear, like third or second movement from Armand Lear, one of his beautiful symphonies. And I see him doing this. And I say, Tilda, we're fucked. He hates the film. He's saying why they use my music in this film. And he's keep doing that until that was like, we were like shocked. And we knew it was over. The movie ends, the lights goes up, we are really dead at that moment. He turns and goes, it's a masterpiece. Can I have my name on the titles? And I said, what? But you're doing no. I said, no, I was conducting. He was conducting. It's true. But the second part of the afternoon is even more enlightening of the condition of a filmmaker and how much a filmmaker has to hook on whatever he or she can hook for the young filmmakers. We had organized a screening for a very important sales company, which we will not name because I decided to become.
To protect the guilty.
I want to be kind, but I'm tempted to say the name. So the movie goes, the movie ends, and these people comes off, they're French, and they look at me and they say, I'm desolate for you. I say, why? The movie doesn't make sense. I say, really? It doesn't make sense. You should edit a movie from scratch and make the movie about the boy, not the mother. And I say, okay, thank you. And I was very happy. I was like laughing because I had John Adams like an hour before. And he said, aren't you, I don't want to upset you, but you should be upset. No, I'm not upset. I'm so happy. John Adams loves the film. I should say the name. No, I'm not going to say it.
It's that scene.
I'm telling you the name afterwards. It's an important company. Another company told me the movie's going to play very well in Italy, but it's going to be a catastrophe around the world. So I'm sorry, we don't want it. Of course, the movie was a catastrophe in Italy and a great success around the world.
I think in a lot of the scenes that we're going to see tonight, you feel this same kind of presence, let's say, of music, of architecture, of the movement of the camera, of the costumes as these highly expressive elements in a way that maybe we could call it a maximalist approach to filmmaking, though that risks sounding like it's an overabundance of something, whereas it actually feels totally integrated into the vision of the film, but that every element that's in the frame.
You could argue that every great filmmakers, and I'm not putting myself into that category, are maximalists, because even Ozu is a maximalist. You know, the choices a filmmaker makes, if the choices are paradigm of the language of cinema, must be maximalistic. Even Romer is a maximalist. What it doesn't want, I mean, cinema is not a medium for average.
Well, I think there are many who...
Then there are people who try, but that's
yeah, exactly. Can you talk more about that? About when you're thinking of a scene in terms of the mise en scène? You know, what
I had spent a lot of time organizing my thoughts and even drawing my thoughts and making so much plans of actions and for many years, and being frustrated because maybe something you thought was not being the way you thought about, and like knowing, not realizing that time was going to be a very evil enemy of my life. And then one day I saw this incredible documentary about the making of Fanny and Alexander by Bergman, which is a movie that I dearly love, another maximalistic film. And you see in this documentary how he, being the master he was, he on set, doing his last movie or almost last movie, after like what, 60 years in the business, he's lost. He's not there to give answers. He's there to make more questions. And he works by adding little elements on little elements on little elements. And he's not shy or embarrassed not to know in front of his crew and his cast. He's actually being helped by these people to to speak the language he needs to speak. And that was a great epiphany for me. And it's in the Criterion collection, you can find it, it's so beautiful. And I realized that I didn't need to be in control to be in control. In order to be in control, you need to prepare yourself not on how you want to shoot the scene, but on the elements that composes the movie, including the good quality of the life of your crew and stuff like that. So after that film, I relaxed, and now I don't do anything. I don't do anything. I'm bad news for my ADs. Because I don't have like a shooting list. I need to know very well the spaces we shoot, but then it's beautiful to go on set and work with your actors, and only after the scene exists in the dynamic of the characters being played, you can see what is the right position for the camera.
And from certainly my own experience observing you on Suspiria, I would say that once you've decided on that, it feels like you very much now see the scene in your head the way that it will be in the finished film, because you may elect, for example, to shoot a scene in one unbroken shot and do no coverage.
Yeah, I don't do coverage. I don't do coverage. I think coverage is for the cowards. No. Coverage is terrible. Coverage is that thing that you shoot, like, you shoot him, me, you, them, and then you trim in this editing room. That's bad. That's bad.
Now, after I Am Love, your next two feature-length films are both documentaries. A beautiful film about Bernardo Bertolucci.
It happened that after I Am Love, I got an agent in America, and then I came more here. I always wanted to work in America. I love America. And I always wanted to work with Hollywood. Like, it was really my vocation, honestly. I believe that the actors, that American actors and the English-speaking actors are by far the most inspiring people for me. And so I thought, oh, they like this movie, I'm gonna make another movie in a minute. And then I've been off to do a bigger splash, which was the remake of a French film called La Piscine, a movie I dearly hated. But because I had been given the chance of being really in control of what I wanted to do, and because I had met this fantastic writer called David Kajanek, and being completely enamored with the idea of working with him, I decided to do this film. But it was difficult to be put together because it was like an ensemble piece, and I learned a lesson that some actors, they don't like to be in an ensemble. When they say the name above the title, they want to be alone there. And at the same time, I started to be given projects that I didn't like. Like, I've been offered so many movies that were about bored ladies betraying the husband. There was a moment, there was a project about, I think, Jackie Kennedy after the death of JFK, she goes to Rangoon or someplace with Lord Arlek, which was the friend of Kennedy, and they become lovers. And there is this scene in which they are starting to make love with the silks and the cashmere and the richness of this location. And the script that was like described, and silently the servants enter and they remove the clothes and they let them make love. And I thought, why they want me to do this film? I must have made something wrong with I Am Love.
But it raises an interesting point that really all of your films are group portraits, and they don't have one protagonist. And,
that's Jonathan Demme again. In Jonathan Demme, you can see that he never dismisses the secondary characters. And every time there is a character that is introduced or comes back in the narrative of Jonathan Demme, somehow the movie shifts toward that character. For instance, in The Silence of the Lambs, which was an amazing film, when Clarice Starling goes down into the cellars of Hannibal Lecter, you meet this guy called Pembry, who is the jail worker who gives her the instruction, and suddenly you are in the movie about Pembry, you know, for like 2 minutes, 1 minute and a half, but that's the movie about. It's about him. And this is an amazing lesson for any filmmakers, that you have to treat equally every character. There is not like the protagonist and then there is the secondary character who are serving the protagonist. Actually, it's the other way around.
And indeed, in a way, when A Bigger Splash starts, you could think that it's going to be a movie about Tilda, who's playing a famous rock star who has lost her voice after vocal surgery, and then suddenly Ray Fiennes' character comes into the movie as the record producer and former lover of Tilda, with his daughter, who he only just discovered he had, in tow, and suddenly it becomes another movie. Sometimes their movie, sometimes Tilda's movie, sometimes the movie of the people of Pantelleria, where the movie takes place. And I think you feel that very much in the scene that we'll look at, where you have all of the characters in the movie kind of together in a moment that I imagine in the script was maybe no more than a few sentences of screen direction.
Well, the sequence we're going to show now has this fantastic monologue written by Dave. But after the monologue, Dave left it like, and Harry Hawks dances on the music. Music is his life. And the second part of the sequence is the visualization of this line.
So let's take a look at A Bigger Splash. This is definitely a movie that was not widely enough seen in its release in America, so hopefully some people will have a chance to catch it in the retrospective. But talk a little bit about the casting of Ray Fiennes, because I think up until this point in his career, he would not have been the first thought of most filmmakers for a role like this. He was not somebody thought of for ostentatious, Dionysian characters, or even somebody who could play comedy, per se.
Well, I've been in love with him since I saw him in Schindler's List, which is a bit sickening to say, but it's true. Then he did this amazing Catherine Bigelow movie, Strange Days. Mm. And I remember I had his picture and Tilda's picture from a newspaper on my wall of young aspiring filmmaker. And then I was trying to put together this movie when I saw the trailer to the Grand Budapest Hotel, Wes Anderson film. And I saw him in this pink uniform, being very humorous and silly and nice. And I hadn't seen the film, I saw the trailer. So I called my agents and I said, can I meet Ray Fiennes? And I met him in LA, and I gave him the script. He's very intense, and he's a great, great artist. So what he does, he looks at you in the eyes, like this. And I look back. And so it became a little war of like, who's gonna resist? And I didn't flinch. And that's when I conquered him. And I gave the script and I said, okay, if you said to me, I'm gonna read, I'm gonna call you back. And I knew it's gonna be like 3 months. 2 days later, the agent calls, Ray wants to meet Luca, but he's in New York now. So I fly to New York and I see him and he meets me and he says, I wanna do it, but how do you know me? I said, I don't know you. I know your movies, I know how great an actor you are, but he felt that was something close to him. And I can tell you that he's not Harry Hawks at all, but he's very humorous and very funny, but also super well prepared actor, amazing.
And this was also your first time working with Dakota Johnson, who would then stay sort of with the stock company for Suspiria. What appealed to you about her? And I think you see in both of these films, you know, her range beyond the 50 Shades of Grey series.
Well, I was looking for an actress to play Penelope, and a friend of mine told me that her client, Untitled Johnson, was very happy with this young actress she had hired to play Anastasia Steele in 50 Shades of Grey. And I've been given the possibility to look at the trailer in advance. It was going to be released like a month later. And I saw the trailer, it was like, interesting. So I said, can I meet her? She was in Europe in a holiday and she came to Crema. And she was very suspicious because Dakota is very sharp, very like, and she was like, very like, And I was like, she wasn't like, hello, hi. She was really like, reserved, to say the least, and a bit tough. Let's say a bit bitchy. And I loved her. Totally. And I said, it's perfect. She's fantastic. First of all, she's a great actress.
Yes.
She's a wonderful friend. I love her.
I felt when we were making Suspiria that there was something almost imperceptible between her and the camera, that she knew so instinctively how to play specifically, for the movie screen.
I think she has a very beautifully non-banal approach to the characters, and she's very patient in how she grows throughout the character. She doesn't need to show off the character in every scene. There are actors who needs to show that the character is there all the time. She doesn't have that anxiety, which I think is fantastic. And also, I love Dakota for Dakota, but at the same time, I can't help myself to see her grandmother in her face.
And her mother.
And her mother, and her father.
Yeah.
Wow.
Call Me By Your Name is now an international breakthrough on another level beyond even what I Am Love had achieved. And ironically, one could say it was a movie that initially you were only going to produce for another filmmaker. The same
I didn't want to do it
Suspiria.
because I didn't want to make another movie about rich people lounging by the pool. That was really impossible for me to grasp.
So how did you then come around? How did you find your way into it?
No, I did it because it was a Call of Duty And because the movie had to be made and there was no other ways in order to be made than making it for a tiny, teeny budget and with me directing it. So I said, okay, let's do it. I think the way was to set the movie in Crema. Mm. I have to be honest. That was really my way into the film. Because this novel, the beautiful novel by Andre Aciman, is set in Liguria, which is where you saw the scene before with Tilda in I Am Love. That's Liguria. By the sea, the summer is a summer by the sea in the book. And it's a Mediterranean summer. And Ivory, for whom I've been working as a producer, trying to put together his version of this film, wanted to set his version of the film in Sicily, by the sea. But my way in came through Crema because Crema was my portal through my memories of films about adolescents coming of age that I loved, like Maurice Pialat films or Arnaud Zemmour or some of the beautiful Comte d'été by Eric Romer, but also a very lovely movie by André Téchiné, The Wild Rose.
Wild Reeds.
Right, Wild Reeds. All these films are set in the countryside, not by the sea, and the time, the pace of the stories are linked to the lazy, unstoppable laziness of the summers in the countryside. And Crema, it's in the north of Italy, has that kind of quality. And I knew the house, so I felt the house was right. There was a lot of elements that were very touching to me about the location and the setting. And that's how I went in. And there was already Timothy on board, also with Ivory, which was, for me, a delight to confirm him into the role. But also I think hiring Army was a very important thing for me.
At one time it was to have been Shia LaBeouf, I believe.
Well, that was when James was supposed to make the film. But with me, it's always been Army.
Were you surprised at all by the kind of huge cult that's developed around this movie? The movie, by any measure, was a huge critical success and a major commercial success relative to what it cost, but there's something beyond that. There's a passionate love that the fans of this movie have for it that seemed to happen almost from the beginning, because I think even before the movie had opened and it had only been shown in film festivals, you had people creating, internet memes and drawings and fan art and the kind of things you almost associate more with big tentpole movies and franchises, that there was a sense of ownership that the audience took of this movie.
I shot a short film recently in Rome, and we shot into a convent of friars. And when I went there for the location scout, I meet these two young friars. And they say, "Oh, Mr. Guadagnino, we're such a big fans. Call me by your name. It's an amazing film." And I say, "Hey guys, are you crazy? It's against your principles." And they look at me and say, "Don't be a bigot." Which means that we made something that somehow have been the most utopian of the storytelling, because it makes completely possible and universal something that is very specific and for many people impossible to grasp. And that makes me very happy, because I myself don't give myself limits. And so I believe very much that love is love. It sounds a bit cheesy, but it's true. And the possibility that the movie talks to different people from different backgrounds and touches them and make them believe in their possibility of being loved or love, and also connect with the bittersweet end of love. It's something great, despite the fact that it's about two boys loving each other.
And in the scene we're going to look at, it is sort of the first moment in the film where this connection, which has been hinted at through some glances, touch, gesture, is really articulated for the first time in dialogue. So take a look at Call Me By Your Name.
Hold this for a second, will you? Going? Sure. Not bad, huh?
Not bad at all. Thought you didn't smoke.
I don't. So World War II, huh?
Oh, no, this is World War I. You have to be at least 80 years old to have known any of them.
Huh. I never even heard of the Battle of Piave.
Battle of Piave was one of the most lethal battles in World War I. 170,000 people died.
Is there anything you don't know?
I know nothing, Oliver.
Well, you seem to know more than anybody else around here.
Well, if you only knew how little I know about the things that matter.
What things that matter?
You know what things.
Why are you telling me this?
Because I thought you should know.
Because you thought I should know?
Because I wanted you to know. 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 Because there's no one else I can say this to but you.
Are you saying what I think you're saying? Don't go anywhere. Stay right here.
You know I'm not going anywhere.
They mixed up all of my pages. They're gonna have to retype this whole thing. I'm not gonna have anything to work on this afternoon. This is gonna set me back a whole day. Damn it.
Shouldn't have said anything.
Just pretend you never did.
Or does that mean we're on speaking terms, but not really?
It means we can't talk about those kinds of things. Okay? We just can't.
Ehi! Andiamo l'americano!
That, of course, is a good example of a scene shot entirely in one unbroken shot. Very beautiful, and it goes maybe back to this idea of the maximalist cinema, but the idea of setting that scene in front of this monument to World War I and then tilting up to reveal it in the middle of the scene. I think in all your films and in all the scenes we've seen tonight, the sense of place is so specific, and within that, this feeling of the characters sort of being surrounded by the weight of history and these generations of people who've inhabited those spaces before them. This is obviously a very strong idea in Suspiria as well, and to the extent that you can articulate it, could you say something about why that's something important for you to include in your films, that sense of history and architecture, for lack of a better way of putting it?
Well, I think that cinema is about the invisible more than the visible, and it's about what is off the frame, and it's about what the layers in the frame. And I think that the way through which you can tell that story comes from the relationship between the space and the figure, or comes through the figure in the space. And I think that if you have to understand or care for a character, you need to make sure that that character exists within his own reality or her own reality. So that's why, for me, space is super important. But at the same time, in this specific case, I mean, the idea that they go in front of a monument of the victims of the World War I comes from the novel. The dialogue is totally lifted from the novel. It's word by word what is in the novel. But I felt like that in order to make that beautiful literary idea from Asimov filmic, we had to encompass the idea that the love that was coming out in that moment between these two boys was somehow shared and lived through by the space where they were. That as much as the youth of the two characters in the movie was reflected in the youth that couldn't express their youth because they died in the war. But at the same time, the unspoken kind of kindness of the place that is bowing to the love of Ellie and Oliver is part of the sequence, to the degree that not only the space becomes a protagonist, but the music is. Because in the movie, Elio is a young, aspiring pianist, and he's transcribing music all the time, and he's working a lot on classics of piano, like, I think this is Debussy or Ravel. My God, sorry, I'm tired. But every time the absence of Oliver is on the screen, he's lacking in the screen, this music comes off. A little bit like a longing, not only a longing of Elio for Oliver, but a longing of the space for Oliver, and a longing of the movie for Oliver. Because I think that what I now understand about the movie, I take time for me to understand my movies, is that this is a movie about wanting Oliver. And so the Oliver is becoming the object of our desires. And the movie participates to the desire of Elio to have Oliver.
I think it struck some people as a shock that you would follow up this film by remaking Suspiria.
But somehow,
but I think we can think of many ways.
Suspiria comes first. Not only because I wanted to make Suspiria since I was a young kid, and we shouldn't say that again, because one of the downsides of my work, of every filmmaker's work, is to do all these interviews when you have to repeat yourself forever. But because I had planned, I was already working on Suspiria with you guys at Amazon when I had accepted to make Call Me By Your Name and generating panic in Amazon. He's doing another movie before we do.
But I think we can talk about lots of ways in which actually Suspiria is very connected to Call Me By Your Name, because it also is a kind of coming-of-age story for Susie, the character of Dakota in the film, and she also has a kind of, let's say, in this case, unrequited romance with her mentor, Madame Blanc, played by Tilda, and or rather the other way around, but very much a movie rooted in these ideas of desire, of a kind of a group of people in an isolated place living together over a course of change of seasons. But perhaps first, also interesting to talk about the ways in which, from a sheer technical perspective, this was the biggest and most elaborate film that you had taken on to this point in your career, a movie with elaborate dance sequences, hundreds of special effects shots, prosthetic makeup, so forth and so on. For you, as the director, what were the biggest challenges? Were they those things? Were they those kind of, let's say, the physical production challenges of the movie, or were there things about this particular story, about having to carry, in a way, the legacy of the original movie that were the biggest challenges?
Well, I think that I understand the concept of the scale and how you approach a movie that is bigger in terms of budget than other movies you made. But at the same time, you know, there is only one way to make films: start and patiently deal with every issues you have to deal with, and answer the questions or get more questions to the table. Sometimes you have a less array of questions, sometimes a wider. From this perspective, Suspiria has not been particularly difficult. Apart from the fact, and that you know better than I do, that sometimes there was some kind of decisions that were made that weren't the right ones, in my opinion. So we had to wait until the right decision was going to be made. But that's normal in any filmmaker
studio relationship.
But I love Scott. I'm very sad that we're not working daily as we did for the last 3 years now. But anyway, I thought that the difficulty that I was going to have, because even in a very, very, very feminine director as I think I am, and female-driven director as I am, there is a tiny misogynist. I thought that it was going to be a hell to direct 38 women. But in fact, it was a delight. It was fantastic. And when we did the big Sabbath scene where everybody naked and mad and with blood everywhere, it was fun. It was fantastic. 5 days of fantasticness. Who saw the movie? You remember Miss Balfour, the woman who sings at the end. She's Christine Lebout. She's a fantastic artist and performer from Belgium. And when we started shooting the scene when she has to carry the body of Olga with the hook, she couldn't do it because she was impressed by the flesh, the fake flesh being pierced. So she was crying. It was fun. It was fun, guys. It was fun. It was the best, really the best.
And of course we
5 days, the Sabbath.
I remember there was a lot of concern from fire safety about the hair on the walls, but which I believe was real human hair. But
that was another moment of the filmmaking that I remember with great pride, because they have this fetish of the hair, the witches. And so I said to Imbal Weinberg, the formidable, feisty and fiery and wonderful production designer of the film, which I with great time working together and a lot of fights, which were both from the Middle East. I'm from Algeria, my mother, and she's from Israel. And I said, I want hair everywhere. And she said, wow, when? We don't have the money. And I remember that I remember my childhood when they were making some plumbing, they used this kind of strange thing that looked like hair, which was, of course, a fiber. And I remember that. I said, get me something like that. And we discovered that you could buy that for nothing. But then you had to put on the walls. Yeah.
So that's what it was.
It was fun.
Well, you mentioned Inbal, and one of my strong memories of when I first came to the set, and it was 2 or 3 days before we started shooting, was watching you go with Inbal through all of the props that were going to be used the first week of the shoot, and in the midst of thousands of other decisions that had to be made in those last hours, saying that this is not the right kind of chewing gum that would be in Susie's suitcase if she was an American girl coming from the Midwest in 1977, and this level of specificity. Is it just easy for you, and maybe it's why you do what you do, to keep track of these kinds of infinitesimal details in the midst of everything else that you have to do?
Devil is in the lack of details, in my opinion. Details is everything. It's really everything. Because how can we ask an audience to pay a ticket and ask them to come into our world if we are creating a world that is shallow, We have to make something that is completely committed to what we want to tell, the story we want to tell. It's really important. When we did I Am Love, and there is a moment in which Eduardo Recchi goes to see his friend Antonio, the chef, and says to him, we bought the land. I bought the land for you, and you can do the restaurant there. I asked a notary to create a contract of acquirement of the land with all the fake passport and stuff. Like all the document was all real. We had to pay the notary to do it as if it was real. And you see briefly in the movie, but it was important to be the right thing. I don't believe in props. I believe in the real things.
Talk a little bit about working with Dave Kajanik on what eventually becomes this version of Suspiria, because like Call Me By Your Name, you were originally attached to the film only as a producer.
Well, no. I started wanting to be making Suspiria when I was a kid. And we bought the rights to remake the movie in 2007. And I was doing Suspiria, I Am Love then. And as I told you, I'm a realist. I am a general who sees the ground and understands if I can hit or not. And at the time, I knew that nobody would have put the money on a movie like Suspiria directed by me. And I had met a wonderful, wonderful filmmaker who became a dear friend of mine, David Gordon Green. And that's where I said to David, would you do Suspiria? And he said yes, but unfortunately, because I would have loved to see his version of the film, the thing didn't happen. So only after David's version never happened, a few years later, and thanks to the success of I Am Love, or let's say the interest that raised on me because of I Am Love, I've been again kind of willing to make this film. And then I had met David Kajanik for A Bigger Splash, and I loved his way. I like the way in which Kajanik writes his script, because they're never centered. They go from the margins to the center, and then back to the margins somehow. Like very beautifully oblique way of writing and fantastic dialogue. And we spent a few days in Los Angeles chatting about what was going to be that we wanted to say about this. And I remember that I said to him that I wanted to start the movie with a protest, and that I wanted to start the movie with a conversation piece. That was the beginning of everything.
And was it from there that I think what really becomes the central...
And 77.
Yeah, that becomes really the central idea of the film is what's going on outside in Berlin in this very violent political moment, and how that mirrors what's going on inside. And ironically, the original movie had taken place also in 1977, but never mentioned politics.
I mean, I was frustrated with the Dario Argento version after I'd been a mega fan of the film, because I couldn't find 77 in the movie, which was released in 77. And I wondered why. I was trying to understand why Dario and Daria Nicolodi had made a movie that was completely sealed in its own fantasy, and they didn't allow the reality of the times in which they were making the movie to come in. I think you can see what I try to say in a masterpiece that is The Exorcist, in which Friedkin is opening, it's the story about a girl being possessed by the devil and the exorcism that follows. But the movie, it's totally permeable of the reality of the times. You can tell that that film exists because of the times in which it has been made. And the anxieties of those times and the Vietnam War were part of the anxieties that then he dragged into the film and made a huge impact into the audiences of the world. Because, what interest lies in the girl being possessed by the devil? But what about the daughter of an actress who's playing a counterculture movie in the turmoil times where the movie is set? Yeah.
A movie we should mention that shares with Suspiria, with your Suspiria, its title designer, Dan Perry.
That's true. Dan Perry, who I love, had made the logo for The Exorcist, but for many, many others.
Yeah. Well, as we said, there is at the same time very much this kind of tender coming-of-age story inside Suspiria, and particularly in the relationship between Susie and Madame Blanc, juxtaposed against these bigger machinations of the society and what is happening inside the coven.
Sometimes, like Fassbinder was a great director of the trappings of love, and particularly on how love can be somehow used as a weapon of dominance of the other. I mean, The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant is in a way the template for this dynamic between women. And in this movie, you can see that there is somehow love between Madame Blanc and Susie, but it's in a way a mirror. It's like a mirror image. It's not the real thing.
Which is maybe one reason why there are so many mirrors in the film, including in the scene that we're going to look at. Think of it as another
advice for young filmmakers. If they tell you that you have to use CGI for mirror scenes, it's not true. Film, then they cancel the camera, okay? You not have to lose your time wanting to put CGI there.
Let's look at Suspiria, or The Bitter Tears of Madame Blanc.
Yes.
Yeah. That's the kind of shot you really want to get right on the first take, because the cleanup is really a pain. And of course, such a great collection of actresses in that scene, including, of course, Angela Winkler from The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum, a movie set in the same historical moment, and Renee Soutendijk of the great early Paul Verhoeven films. I have to feel that
Sylvie Testud.
And Sylvie Testud.
Who kills herself.
Who kills herself. I was it's such joy. I remember also one of my first days on the set when our brilliant makeup artist, Marc Coulier, was rigging Sylvie with the rig for her bleeding neck and was spraying fake blood all over. I thought, you know, as a kid who grew up loving all those kind of horror movies with Dick Smith, makeup effects and that kind of thing, I felt I had come to the right place. But it does make me think that as yourself as a former film critic, that you take some pleasure in inserting some kind of hidden intertextual cinema references in your movies, whether it's these actresses being cast in this film with their connections to the art house cinema of the 70s, or the conversation about Buñuel that pops up suddenly in the midst of Call Me By Your Name.
Well, one of the most touching things that happened to me in the last years has been an interview that Bernardo Bertolucci gave, in which he spoke about me and the fact that he sees in me somebody like him that start to think of cinema through cinema, which is true. For all the importance I give to the details of reality, it's always through cinema that I think of cinema. So for me to do a movie like this, in which the people that inhabits the movie are carrying with them their history of cinema, it's
Jessica Harper, of course,
and
her connection to the originals.
Of course, and we shouldn't forget Ingrid Caven, but also Fred Kellerman, the great director of photography, and a filmmaker, a wonderful filmmaker himself, who plays one of the cop, the one that is not naked. He didn't want to. He said, I'm gonna do it without nudity. I said, okay. Yeah, it's I don't know, it's very inspiring to me, something that I like a lot.
And before we turn it over to the audience, I'm curious also, and I know these things aren't always that easy to express, because a lot of this is an instinctual thing that artists like yourself do, but when you're first presented with a piece of material, whether you're reading a script or a novel like Call Me By Your Name, what is the moment for you in which you feel that this is something you might want to make as a film? What separates a piece of material you might enjoy?
It's really never about the material. Now I kind of know that it's never about the material. It's always about the meeting with somebody. It's really about the chance I have to meet someone I want to be with, more than anything else. Whether it's an actor or some actors or a writer. And it's also about the place. But it's never really about the material. I think like material is overrated because all the stories has been told. But how beautiful is to discover a new person in life, no?
Questions from the audience. I'm sure we have many, and we have some microphones that are coming down the aisles, and please stand up when you speak so that everybody can see you. Why don't we can start right here with this lady in the red dress there, yes.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
First, I want to say that Suspiria Twitter account is a delight. It's wonderful. But I wondered, can you talk a little bit about the process of working with musicians, Sufjan Stevens and Tom York, to have music created for your films?
Well, those were two very different processes, because with Sufjan, at the beginning of my first idea was to have him playing the narrator. My idea was that there was this person, Sufjan Stevens, somehow interrupting the narrative and stepping into the camera and singing a song like Sister Carol East does in Something Wild.
Something Wild, yeah, that's right.
I also wanted to have a voiceover that was telling us things about the times in which the story was happening. And then I spoke to him after many times I tried, and he said to me, forget about it, I'm never gonna do it. So suddenly all my ideas went, but then he said to me, I can do you a song. And then he gave me 3 songs, 2 songs, new songs, and then adaptation of Futile Devices. With Tom, I always knew that in order to overcome, let's say, the kind of anxieties that an audience would have had in going to Suspiria again, in a new Suspiria, thinking of the legacy of the very important score by the Goblin, we had to have someone whose voice was somehow almost like the voice of my generation, and Tom definitely is. And I respect him so deeply as an artist that, having never wanted to work with any composers in my career, I handed him the first time in which I really wanted to work with a composer. With him, who wasn't a composer yet, now he is. So I look forward to work with him again and again.
Luca, can you speak to how you ferret out people around you in the production team to find their Scott? I know we have a vibrant filmmaking group in the Twin Cities, and I believe that if Scott wasn't assigned to your project, your artistic vision would have been compromised. And I think that's pretty clear from one of the answers today. So maybe we should cut Scott out of the spotlight because he's still working for his current employer. But I think that he probably risked his livelihood to make sure that your artistic vision was presented in Suspiria. And if you can kind of explain to young people, how were you able to realize you could trust Scott, and how did you forge that bond with him that allowed you to put the trust in him that he would talk to the company that was producing your film and convince them that you were right and that you needed to film it in the way you did?
This is an incredibly complex question, super difficult answer, and I can step on many shits by answering. Well, first of all, I agree that the, let's say, singularity of Suspiria happens to be happening in reality because of Scott's endorsement, but also Ted Hope. The movie started because I had this conversation with them, with Ted Hope, and Scott found us. And they never shied away from the commitment to this film the way we wanted to make this film. Also, I have been a big fan of Scott forever because I have 2 erotic fantasies in my mind: filmmaker, directors, and film critics. In fact, my partner is a film director, and I was a film critic myself, so I knew his work so much. So he came to see me in Crema, and yeah, we buddied immediately. And then I started to molest him because he has these big muscles, so I touched the muscles. We can say it out loud, so you cannot denounce me after. I admitted. He's great. Scott is fantastic. I think it's important that in a process you are really, you say everything, and you stick to your word. Because if you say, I'm gonna do this movie with these actors, I'm gonna have this composer, the movie's gonna be like this, this, and that, then you have to make it the way you said it, right? The only thing, The only thing that I missed, I said the movie is going to be 90 minutes. And of course it's 2 hours and a half. But apart from that, I really meant what I said.
Yeah, and I would only add to that I think, you know, on any movie, you want to make sure everyone's making the same film. I mean, that includes all the you know, the crew and the cast, obviously, but also the studio. And I think that it was a good match in that sense, and that, you know, movie like this only comes into existence.
My dream is that Scott move on to the studio where I do my next movie, whatever it is.
Thank you very much.
Can you stand up, please?
Sure.
Yeah.
In respect to Suspiria, kind of one of the interesting departures from the first one was where Susie is potentially the victim of the coven. It seems that, you know, she comes into the coven in your version and comes to take over. And where did that idea come from, where she was not the victim, but kind of the savior or the...
I'm a big fan of horror films, and always in the horror films the trope is that there is a running woman being slaughtered. But that's not my cup of tea. I want empowerment.
Plus, it's nice to have a twist, you know.
Yeah, but that's the little thing. The point is about empowerment. None of these women are victims. They're fighting with one another. The victim of his delusions is the old man. But the women are not victims. And I think it's important to portray women that are not victims.
There we go.
Hi, Luca. It's Robert from San Francisco, and thank you for being here. My question is about location. In your films, a lot happens around a dining table. In I Am Love, we learn about an affair. In Call Me By Your Name, Elio tells his father that he almost had sex. And in Suspiria, we get election results around the table. Can you please share your thoughts about location?
Well, I said it before, it's important the space. Location is really about how the dynamic in the script can be played out in a non-verbal way in the first place. Because you spoke about the tables, I think we can say that we spend so much time, at least we Italians, around the table, that it's part of my personal landscape.
Over there, yes.
Hi, my name is Samira. So I'm a filmmaker. I feel like I work really deeply from like my own personal experience, and like right now, like through the films I've made through school and like outside of it, I feel like I've worked really deeply with like who I am as a person, as an artist, and like maybe one other personal friend. And I have a really hard time like feeling not necessarily the authority, but feeling like I can tell other people's stories. And I was attracted to films because I see like the power of looking at something on screen that's like a very private, personal truth, and I've connected to it, but it's somebody completely different than myself, except for like that one thing. And I was just wondering, like, you write a lot about women, and obviously like you're not a woman. But I was wondering, have you ever like had doubts about like entering the head of a female and like portraying her story on screen, or do you not really feel that?
This question would be valuable if I was a writer, probably, but not even, because I mean the boundaries of human imagination should be limitless. But when you do a movie, you are not working in a vacuum by yourself, you know? I'm not entering into the mind of a woman. I'm building a world with many collaborators, starting from the stars who plays the roles, who contribute to the role in equal measure than me. They're not puppeted by me. So yeah, no, I have no doubts about that, because I value the collaboration, but I also believe that there is no limits that you have to give yourself, but the respect of others, probably.
Hi, thanks for coming all this way from Italy. Appreciate it. I was wondering, compared to the original Suspiria, which is almost aggressively colorful, your version is very muted and kind of almost grayscale. I was just wondering, can you talk to me about why you made that choice?
I didn't remake Suspiria to remake the language of Suspiria. And I think that is a sort of misdirection, you know? By the way, Suspiria has been somehow quoted, ripped, remade so many other times. The real remake of Suspiria is Neon Demon by Nicholas Winding Refn, in that perspective, in which some other filmmaker encompasses almost literally the language, the stylistic language of the film. Dario Argento's film touched me when I saw it on many multiple levels, but definitely one of those were the emboldening of making films, and making films that were not just obvious choices. And at the same time, as we discussed before, was about the time in which the movie was made, that was as important as the movie itself. So when we did our film, we didn't thought of the elements, formal elements, the formalistic elements, in a sort of antagonistic way toward Dario's film. We just thought about our story, our setting, the world in which it was set. We had some references. Many of those came from the experience of the cinema of Michael Ballhaus and Rainer Fassbinder. I don't see that as muted, to be honest. I think it's super colorful. There are so many colors in this Suspiria. It's just that they're not primary colors used in a way, in a surrealistic way. They're really integrated to the environment of the film.
So your question about material may have already answered this question, but I'd feel guilty not asking this being in Minnesota. I recently read that you're working on a project of Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks, and I was just wondering where you're at with that project, or what inspired you to work on that material.
I've been approached by Rodrigo Teixeira, a very dear friend and Brazilian producer who had produced Call Me By Your Name with me. He had acquired the rights to make a movie from Blood on the Tracks, the masterpiece by Bob Dylan, one of the masterpieces of Bob Dylan. And he came to me saying, would you do a movie from it? And I found definitely charming the idea of making a movie from a music album. And I said, it's super interesting. Why not? But at the same time, I felt like instinctively that there was one person I wanted to try to make a movie from that album. And this person was a writer that I admired so much, whose movies were for me really companions. Richard LaGravenese, who wrote Fisher King, Little Princess, Beloved by Jonathan Demme, The Bridges of Madison County, Behind the Candelabra. And so I met with Richard, and Richard and I, we suddenly matched. And he said, sure. So as I said before, the great interest I had for Blood on the Tracks was met by my passion for Richard LaGravenese. And so we worked together. Richard gave me brilliant script, like something really beautiful and very touching that we will shoot later this year.
Hi, Luca. My name's Tom. Come from warm Florida to meet you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Tom.
Two questions, both about Call Me By Your Name. It was interesting what you said, that when you finally decide to make a movie, it's a person that you meet for the first time that helps you make that decision. And I'd like to know, in Call Me By Your Name, who was that person? And my second question is, if there's going to be a sequel, and I hope there will be, and I'm sure a lot of other people hope there will be, will we get to see the villa again? Will that come alive as a character again? Because it's sitting there empty and it's sad to see.
I think the house was the person that made me make the movie. And as I said, also Army somehow. And I think that life brings you to places, you know, like we can live a life being steady in one place, but at the same time our lives really move us around the world or different worlds. So as far as the story of Call Me By Your Name and the events that are around that summer of 1983 for Ellie and Oliver are crucially set in that house, I do believe that if we're gonna see these people again, and I think we will, that's not necessarily that we're gonna see them in that house or in Crema. Don't forget that Elio is a very talented pianist. And don't forget that his father is American. And the mother is French.
We're just about out of time, although we will be in the lobby.
There is another question. There is a gentleman standing.
This is just really quick and actually ponies off of that. With the idea of a sequel to Call Me By Your Name, for me personally, I think the first film ends beautifully. So my first part of the question is, what is the merit of following these two farther down the road in their lives? And then I just read something recently where you said you were waiting for the right script to come along, and now here tonight you're saying material isn't...
I haven't said that.
Oh, well then somebody lied in a newspaper somewhere. So what in your mind would that look like? And is it
I
so
think
important to see
that I think if you call it a sequel, you're going to be biased. Because it's not a question of sequel. Sequel comes with the concept of an industrial idea that needs to exploit the success of something that has been coming before, you know? Rambo, Rambo 2, Rambo 3, that's sequels. I am more interested in the people, the fictional and the real people that made the film. And if we assume that Elio, Oliver, Annella, Sam, Mafalda, Marzia are interesting people, and I think we can assume they are, I want to see these people again, and maybe again, and again. I'm not claiming to capitalize on the success of Call Me By Your Name. I'm claiming my emotional desire to meet these people again. And in meeting them, to meet the people that gave birth to these people again. To spend time with my friends, with my lovers, the people together with I made love making them film, and we generated this film. To summarize what I'm trying to say in a very foggy way, it's what Truffaut did with the Antoine Doinel cycle. He made 5 films, 4 features and 1 short film, because he had discovered this person, Antoine Doinel, and this person, Jean-Pierre Léaud, that he wanted to to stay with throughout his life. And I hope this answer is going to be like the final answer about the idea of a sequel from Call Me by Your Name, because it's true. It is exactly that. You know, actually, it's the only reason why.
Luca Guadagnino, thank you so much.
I should touch your passion.